Hey, Danielle.
Hey Hannah, good to see you.
You too. Well, welcome back to our listeners and viewers. Our topic today is critical pedagogy. This is our second episode of our learning series, kind of these little short learning series that we're doing. Today's segment will be about 15 minutes. If you did not take a look at our previous segment, we talked about oppression and defined oppression, talked about how oppression interacts with social work and students and their learning. So check that out. And today, Danielle, critical pedagogy.
Yeah, well, let's start with just the word critical because that's another term that we hear a lot. So, what does that even mean?
So we hear that a lot. So we hear that primarily with critical race theory. So most people understand like this race theory, right? They center on the race part of critical race theory, but critical studies and critical theory in general is really the kind of attempt to critique and reveal power structures. So when folks are talking about critical something, right? Critical pedagogy, critical race theory, they're really talking about like let's unpack this and try to understand how power, oppression, is showing up in these spaces.
Yeah, so it really does build on kind of that concept of oppression and the ways in which that shows up in society, maybe some ways that we might see it behaviorally with our clients, with our students, with the communities that we work with.
Yeah, and students, right? If we're talking about critical pedagogy, students are in the classroom, social work students are doing this every day. They're in the classroom, critiquing, unpacking, unveiling, revealing. They're doing all of these things to better understand power and how power impacts the people that they're working with.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we're talking about critical pedagogy, I'm most familiar with that term. I think about bell hooks as kind of a prominent educator. And when I think about kind of her critiques of power and her just the way she kind of took up space in the classroom, I think about this kind of ongoing critique of learning institutions, of schools, of kind of the expectations that we kind of thrust upon students and the way that that changes their trajectories or their abilities to intervene in a really critical way. So if we think about schools and learning institutions as like a primary place where power is maintained, power is reinforced, some of these ideals are reinforced, and then by proxy, that means other folks are oppressed, right? When we think about Bell Hook's critical pedagogy model, she's really inviting educators to create spaces where students can kind of analyze their political positions, their social positions, and understand the ways that they might leverage their power or leverage kind of the positions that they hold to create better freedom or more liberation for the communities that they serve. Is that kind of what we're talking about today?
Absolutely. And Hooks, right, is an educator, scholar, writer, theorist, right? I mean, just like everything.
She's
Um,
doing it all.
all the things, right? This really, really impactful and important, really leader. And as you were talking, I just kept thinking about, one of Hooks's books called Teaching to Transgress, Education as the Practice of Freedom. And I wonder, when you think about students, right, we think about MSW students, BSW students, these are folks who have been students for a long, long time, right? They're kind of professional students. What does that mean when you think about that as students are engaging in, again, another level of interaction in the classroom? Education as the practice of freedom. How do we see that actually unfolding?
Yeah, I kind of think about it. I like to use the term invitation because I think it is for folks that have been within learning institutions for a long time. It's not, it's not common to disrupt these well-established institutions. And so when we're looking at BSW students or MSW students, we are actually seeing them as these emergent change agents, and we need to invite them into a space where they can not only critique and analyze some of the, theory that they're learning, but they can learn how to integrate that into their lives, into their work. And that kind of helps them make meaning of what it means for them as a professional that's also impacted by these systems. And I think part of that is like acknowledging this relational dynamic that has to be built with the supervisor and with the work site, with their colleagues that they might be in spaces with, because we're asking them to have a lot of vulnerability. We're asking them to sort of acknowledge areas of growth that they might have, maybe areas that they wish they would have behaved differently or things they wish they would have done differently, ask for advice around things, and really sort of invite them into this space of being this learner that gets to grow and pursue liberation and freedom through education.
Yeah, and you have to have a safe relationship to do that. And that's why the supervisory relationship is so important here, is because students should be able to come to that, supervision or that meeting or just in general and say, I don't know what to do, right? This is really difficult. How do I do this? And so we hear, right, critical pedagogy, and we think like, I don't know. I'd love to do that someday. But in reality, we're doing it all the time.
We're doing it all the time. And I think something that I see frequently is sort of this inability to integrate what's happening in kind of the real world into the classroom spaces. And so I think that's an invitation for field instructors to kind of name current events and to invite those conversations into this space, because that's another sort of obvious layer that we can introduce that we all interact with all day long. So how do we sort of critique information, critique our news sources, get accurate data, look at the research, look at the history, and make sense of kind of the implications of some of these power structures that have been around for a long, long time.
Absolutely. And we'll talk about in our training, and then we've got some resources in our workbook to really encourage this invitation, as you said, for students and for field instructors, task supervisors, and educators, right, to engage in this process of invitation. And part of what that means is vulnerability on the supervisor or on the educator. How do you see that? How do you see that vulnerability showing up?
Yeah, so it's a reciprocal kind of relationship, right? And obviously, we need to kind of hold our role, but we also need to call out the power dynamic that exists there, right? Because there is an inherent power dynamic being the licensed person or the field supervisor. We are kind of gatekeepers in this way.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it really, this sort of critical pedagogy and bringing critical theory into these spaces invites us to name all of these dynamics and invite your student to collaborate with you on how you're going to address those things, right? What are the parameters that we're going to set up for each other and for ourselves? And then how are we going to hold those boundaries? Because that's really important. It keeps us safe, it keeps them safe, it keeps the school and the institution safe. But we do need to be preparing them for having these conversations on their own, having these conversations with their colleagues. I'm wondering, as we think about education as being kind of one of, if not the top intervention for increasing empowerment, increasing liberation, and we see this globally, right? Like this is not a new concept, but how do you see sort of empowerment and liberation coming through in the classroom once we start to bring critical pedagogy into these spaces?
I think that's a great question. I was thinking about what you had said earlier around just how old these institutions are. Right. And not just the physical institution, right? Not just a university or a school, but the practice of education and who was excluded, right? So from the very, very beginning of higher education in particular, people were excluded. It was really only for a small section of society. And over time, that has expanded. Yet at the same time, Danielle, we see representation completely different based on which community you're from, areas of marginalization and proximity to power, like we talked about in our last episode. And it brings me to what Hooks is really talking about. So Bell Hooks is really talking about envisioning and practicing a more inclusive and equitable, like educational landscape. And then how do we get there, right? That's kind of your question, is like, well, how do we get there? Part of that is critiquing. Part of that is unpacking. And so students get to practice that reflex. And I always talk about it as a reflex. Students get to practice that reflex of critiquing, right? In that space, and they get to bring that into the field. That's their job, is to say, how can I take this, what I just learned, this critique, this reflex, and really put it into practice? And if students are not doing that, how do we then invite them? I think that's your question, right? Is how do we invite them to do that? And part of that's going to be modeling and role modeling. I think that's
Absolutely.
part of, what our jobs are in terms of why this relationship with students is so important, because we are role modeling empowerment, we're role modeling liberation, and that really starts in the classroom, and it starts with that relationship.
Yeah, I think modeling is so important. And of course, we're going to talk about specific steps to engage critical pedagogy when we do our training. But hearing you say modeling, I'm just brought to this idea of kind of sitting in that tension. So practicing that for ourselves, like it can be really
Yeah.
uncomfortable when you start to unpack oppressive practices or the maintenance of power. So we have to grow in our skill to sit with that, but there's also this inherent tension in the social work field where we are, by our code of ethics, we have to be kind of these disruptors that challenge the status quo, that sort of pursue better futures and better opportunities for these oppressed groups that the system isn't designed for. And we are often agents of the system and the institution. And so as we're having these conversations with students, they're feeling the tension, we're feeling the tension, and we kind of have to, it's a delicate dance, but we don't want that critique to go away, but we want folks to learn how to appropriately critique. Critical thought is so important. So we want
Yeah.
to, obviously nurture that, but we want to make sure that students know how to go about it in a way that's going to be effective, that's going to keep them safe, and that isn't going to make them feel like they're burned out before they're even entering the field.
Yeah. And it can be difficult, as shared. You and I have talked about this in our own work, and just you and I are students, right? We're navigating our own work at a different level. And it can be challenging to have a policy critique that you wrote, or that you are also, in charge of, or a process, right? An intake process that's maybe ineffective, but is the process. And so students, their jobs are to kind of sniff those out. And I think that's just part of it, right? If you have a student, and if you've had students before, you likely know they're going to spot the thing that's ineffective very quickly, because that's their job. And so you're right. You do have to have a space to tolerate that. And we'll talk through, right, in our training, kind of increasing tolerance for that tension. And that's this work. That's the fun part of this work. It can be really fun.
It can totally be fun. The other thing, as I'm hearing you say that is this really kind of growth edge that we, of course, work with our students on. And it's a big part of anti-oppressive supervision and anti-oppressive practice, but it's really reflecting on kind of the values of the field, your own values, your own positionality, what that means, and then how that might create tension or create different relationship dynamics with the communities and clients that you serve, even the stakeholders, even
Yep.
specific positions in the field, right? Um, or different positions. And so I'm thinking, where does our next podcast kind of fall into this?
Well, I think that's a great question and a great segue. So part of our next podcast, so we talked about and defined really this idea of critical. Like, what does critical mean? So it's really unpacking and revealing structures of power. And our next episode is going to be talking about critical reflection and the role of critical reflection and supervision. And so we're going to talk through that. That's going to be a significant part of our training series and workbook. And we're going to use Stephen Brookfield's 4 lenses of critical reflection. So I'm really excited. It's going to be a really fun space. I know you and I both have a lot of affinity for critical reflection and what that means.
Absolutely. Great. So more practical tips to come. More practical tips to come in our workbook and of course in our training where we're going to practice some of these things. We'll get into critical reflection next time. And we'll link some resources around bell hooks and critical pedagogy and some tools that folks can use in that regard with our show and our YouTube video.
Absolutely. And we're doing critical pedagogy.
It's happening.
We're doing it.
It's happening.
This
We're
is
doing
it. This is it.
it's happening right now.
Right now.
You
Absolutely.
weren't here, folks. It happened.
It's gonna continue to happen. Okay, Danielle, great to see you. I will see you in our next episode. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks.